morning. My name is Meg Hoke, and I welcome you to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Hendersonville. We are an inclusive community of faith for all ages, gathering in covenant to celebrate life in all its joy and mystery, inspire journeys of truth and meaning, engage in practice and service for love, justice, and peace. I'm glad you found us and are watching this service. Please visit our website to find more opportunities to connect with others in these strange and socially distanced times. We continue to be a vibrant, caring community, even though we are not currently meeting in person. I'm going to start this service with a chalice lighting called A Spark of Hope by Melanie Davis. If ever there were a time for a candle in the darkness, this would be it. Using a spark of hope, kindle the flame of love, ignite the light of peace, and feed the flame of justice. Our guest speaker today is Lyndon Harris. And he is a forgiveness teacher, coach, and inspirational speaker. His journey to forgiveness began as a priest in charge of St. Paul's Chapel across from the former World Trade Center in New York City in the aftermath of 9/11. Harris teaches a forgiveness methodology based on the research of and in collaboration with Dr. Fred Luskin and the Stanford Forgiveness Project out of Stanford University. For our reading this morning, Lyndon has asked for this passage from the Bible. And it is a reading of the parable of the wheat and the tares, Matthew 13:24-30. Jesus presented another parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and left. And when the wheat sprouted and produced grain, then the weeds also became evident. And the slaves of the landowner came and said to him, 'Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds?' And he said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' The slaves said to him, 'Do you want us then to go and gather them up?' But he said, 'No, while you are gathering up the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Allow both to grow together until the harvest, and at the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, first gather up the weeds and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" We will now continue with Lyndon Harris' presentation.
Good morning. It's really good to be back with you. Thank you for the kind invitation for me to speak again to the Unitarian Fellowship here in Hendersonville. Some dear friends, thank you. I'm speaking to you on Monday, January the 18th, Martin Luther King Day, and it's 2 days ahead of the inauguration, historic inauguration on January 20th of President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. I'm hoping and praying that it's smooth sailing from here to there and that all will be well and we will start a new chapter on January 20th. But what a crazy time we're living through these days, right? It reminds me of a comic strip I saw a few years ago. It might have been on Far Side. A guy's driving down the road and he comes to a fork in the road. The road splits to the right and to the left, and there's signage. And going to the right, he will travel headlong towards doom and destruction. To the left, total annihilation. With a look of shock and dismay on his face, the caption says, "Please pray that I choose wisely. Pray that I choose wisely." Maybe that's our mental state right now. On its face, many of us might be inclined to see our situation much in the way of this cartoon, a violent attack on the Capitol, with the perpetrators still by and large running loose, an ever threatening lethal pandemic whose precipitating virus seems to be evolving into an even more contagious strain. Doom and destruction, total annihilation. That feels about right, doesn't it? Pray that we choose wisely. The events of January 6th are still deeply disturbing to me, as I am sure they are for you. Rabble rousers from around the country converged on Washington, recruited by the president and his enablers. He promised in a tweet that the events of the day, January 6th, would be wild. In caps. They came, seeking to save our democracy by overturning the presidential election results as they were being certified by a joint session of Congress. They came, convinced that the president had been cheated, that the election was rigged. It's an assertion that's been proven wrong by the results of about 60 lawsuits in dozens of courts, including the Supreme Court. Nevertheless, 8 senators and over 130 members of the House of Representatives gave credence to this fallacy. Egged on by the president and his supporters, these insurrectionists stormed the halls of the Capitol chanting slogans like, "Stop the steal," "Hang Mike Pence." They declared a desire to put a bullet in Nancy's head and to take back our country. This angry but organized mob wreaked havoc throughout our so-called temple of democracy. For the first time in our country's history, the Confederate flag was paraded through these hallowed but now defiled halls. This has become what scholars of fascism call the big lie, the cynical questioning of the legitimacy of the ballots cast in 4 states. One of the most compelling pieces of journalism I've read recently is by Timothy Snyder, a history professor at Yale who specializes in understanding historical manifestations of fascism. His longish article in the New York Times on Sunday, January 10th, entitled "The American Abyss," is well worth a read. The big lie was also on full display on January 3rd when President Trump attempted a shakedown of the Georgia Secretary of State, demanding that he must find another 11,780 votes in order to overturn the election in Georgia. The audio of this phone call was made public. Perhaps some of you listened to it. Dan Rather's assessment of it seems to me to be the best. The Trump audio is like telling the Nixon tapes to, "Hey, hold my beer." But what we discover, if we pay attention, if we look closely, is that President Trump didn't create this acrimony out of thin air, as much as we blame him for it. He's not totally responsible for it. Philosopher Ken Wilber says the president is not the cause, but is rather a symptom of our current malaise. But he was a master in playing on sympathies and grievances and angers that have been simmering for generations. It feels intractable, doesn't it? It feels like a choice between doom and despair on the one hand and total annihilation on the other. Where do we go from here? It's not the first time we've been through difficult straits in our country. Where do we go from here? This is the title of a book by the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., on whose day we celebrate today. And this isn't the first time we've lived through challenges. After a tumultuous journey of civil rights activism, Dr. King took time out to seclude himself in a house without a phone, radio, or TV early in 1967 in order to write what would become his final book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? Recounting the struggles of civil rights workers, anti-war activists, peacemakers, and problem causers, king in his final chapter, a chapter entitled The World House, declared, "Some years ago, a famous novelist died. Among his papers was found a list of suggested plots for future stories, the most prominently underscored being this one. A widely separated family inherits a house in which they have to live together. This is the great new problem of mankind. We have inherited a large house, a great world house, in which we have to live together, black and white, Easterner and Westerner, Gentile and Jew, Catholic and Protestant, Muslim and Hindu, a family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interest, but who, because we can never live apart again, must learn somehow to live with each other in peace. A world house, to live with each other in peace. How do we do that? As we wring our hands worrying about what to do, let's consider the wisdom of Jesus' parable of the wheat and the tares. You could interpret this parable in the usual way. The good and the bad grow together in the same place for a lifetime. And at the end, the good goes to the barn, the bad is burned. In other words, the righteous go to heaven and the sinners go to hell. But I'd like to look at it in another way. To separate people out into us versus them, good versus evil, is not ultimately helpful, in my opinion. Rather, I'd like to explore another interpretation of the parable. I think the fact that the wheat and the tares, the good and the evil, are growing together is a truth about each one of us. No one of us is perfectly good. No one of us is completely evil. Each one of us has within our own hearts the capacity for both good and evil. But I want to be clear. This is not an essay or an attempt in moral equivalency. What happened at the Capitol on January 6th, in my opinion, was evil. And what happens when politicians foment anger and grievances that turn to violence is helpful to no one, not even to those who promote it. But we live in a world house, and what we do to others impacts us as well. My wife Maria recommended to me the new book by Isabel Wilkerson entitled Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents, which I'm beginning to read now. It's an eye-opening expose of the history of racial inequality in our country, our original sin, if you will. Corresponding to King's notion of a world house, she brilliantly compares the US experiment in democracy with an old house. She says, "We in the development world are like homeowners who inherited a house on a piece of land that is beautiful on the outside, but whose soil is unstable, loam and rock, heaving and contracting over generations, cracks patched, but the deeper ruptures waved away for decades, centuries even. Many people may rightly say, I had nothing to do with how this all started. I have nothing to do with the sins of the past. My ancestors never attacked indigenous people. They never owned slaves. And yes, not one of us was here when this house was built. Our immediate ancestors may have had nothing to do with it. But here we are, the current occupants of a property with stress cracks and bowed walls and fissures built into the foundation. We are the heirs to whatever is right or wrong with it. We did not erect the uneven pillars or joists, but they are ours to deal with now." And she goes on, "America is an old house. We can never declare the work over. Wind, flood, drought, and human upheavals batter a structure that is already fighting whatever flaws were left unattended in the original foundation. When you live in an old house, you may not want to go to the basement after a storm to see what the rains have wrought. Choose not to look, however, at your own peril. The owner of an old house knows that whatever you are ignoring will never go away. Whatever is lurking will fester, whether you choose to look at it or not. Ignorance is no protection from the consequences of inaction." Whatever you are wishing away will gnaw at you until you gather the courage to face what you would rather not see. Regarding our world house and the things we'd rather not see, another thing Dr. King said is that we must learn to live together as brothers, or we will perish together as fools. We must learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or we will perish together as fools. That's a heavy thought to ponder. Reminds me of another voice I deeply miss hearing today, the raspy voice of Pete Seeger. Pretty much every concert I ever heard Pete do, he started out by saying, if we're going to have a human race 100 years from now, and that's not a given, by the way, but if we're going to have a human race 100 years from now, it will be because we figured out a way to talk to people who disagree with us or who are different from us. So we're at a crossroads. What shall we do? During this season of COVID, I've turned to the literature of escape to help me manage my stress, especially the literature of science fiction. It's been great fertilizer for my imagination. I've been enthralled with the writings of Octavia Butler, an African-American science fiction writer who died in 2006, but whose 1998 novel, The Parable of the Sower, just made it onto the New York Times bestseller list this past September, 14 years after her death, 22 years after its publication. There's a great article about her in the New York Times recently on January 15th, if you're interested. In her Parables series, Octavia Butler writes about a dystopian future of societal breakdown, a breakdown spurred on by a politician president who is backed by ultra right-wing political parties, citizen militia, and the religious right. What could go wrong? Sound familiar? And what was this politician's campaign slogan in Butler's novel, written in 1998? Make America Great Again. Butler, in her work as an Afrofuturist, held that all social justice work is a work of science fiction, a work of the imagination. We're at a crossroads, and we must use our imaginations to navigate, to find our way, to dream of building deeper communities of peace and reconciliation, living together in our one world house. Not being in denial about our situation, but as Isabel Wilkerson says, to look into the basement, to analyze the rafters, and to find ways to improve our inherited house. It's easier said than done, I know. Einstein said that imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution. In his blog post entitled The Power of Imagination, E.B. Kevin says, imagination is the ability to form mental pictures or ideas in the mind. Every material thing that was created by humans was first imagined. The inventor of the car imagined it before inventing it. The inventor of the internet imagined it before inventing it. The inventors of airplanes imagined them before inventing them. What would it look like if we were to begin our days imagining what King's notion of a world house might look like? What would it look like if we could find a better way to live together in this house and each day work to make it better? Remember, unity doesn't mean uniformity, and peace doesn't mean an absence of conflict. Peace means working together to transform conflict and to grow from it. Finally, there was a great interview on NBC News last week with former DHS official Daryl Johnson, He's also the author of the new book, Hate Land, a long, hard look at America's extremist heart. Johnson warns that the insurrection on January 6th isn't the final chapter. Political violence could get worse unless we take the right steps to mitigate the threat. He was asked how to mitigate this threat. Here's his answer. If you've got family members, neighbors, coworkers that are a part of these movements, rather than ostracize and debate and criticize and isolate them, we need to love them, have compassion, and bring them into the mainstream. The only way you're going to get rid of hate is through love. Every person I've ever known about that's been a white supremacist has left the movement through an act of compassion or love. They didn't leave it because someone convinced them that their belief systems were wrong. For inspiration, have a look at the story of Daryl Davis, an African American jazz musician in Baltimore who works on converting Ku Klux Klan members by meeting them where they are and showing them love. He's got quite a track record of success. This is where we go from here. Our future depends on it. Finding ways to talk with people, to talk to people with whom we disagree. Finding ways to identify the problems with our inherited world house and then working to make it better. Using our imaginations to create community that we seek to create. North Carolina's own Reverend William Barber made a statement years ago that has haunted me ever since. He said that if we can't look into the eye of our bitter enemy and see the possibility of redemption, we're not walking the right path. That's not easy, even for me as a forgiveness teacher. But we are at a crossroads. With imagination and love, let us pray we have the wisdom to make good choices for our future and for our children. I can hear John Lennon's song playing now. Imagine. Amen.
Many thanks to Lyndon Harris for sharing those wise and thoughtful words with us this morning. And thank you to everyone else for sharing this time of worship with us. Please remember to check out our website for more fellowship opportunities. We close today's worship with words from a hymn by Jacob Trapp, which is usually sung to the tune of an African American spiritual, which I'm not singing today. Let freedom span both east and west, and love both south and north, in universal fellowship throughout the whole wide earth. In beauty, wonder everywhere, let us communion find. Compassion be the golden cord, close binding humankind. Live in peace, and may the fire of this fellowship be with you.